Welcome to a new movie review, and I'm looking at the 1979 movie Yanks, which was directed by John Schlesinger, written for the screen by Colin Welland. He's also the storyteller on this, and the cast. And of course, there will be a slide. In the lead role is Richard Gere. He plays Matt Dyson. Lisa Eichhorn is Jean Moreton. Vanessa Redgrave plays Helen, and William Devine plays John, and Chuck Venera is Danny Ruffalo. Wendy Morgan plays Molly, and Rachel Roberts, who's the mother of Jean, she is Claire Morton, and Tony Melody is her husband Jim. And there is an extensive cast. There will be a slide, so you can peruse that at your leisure. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the plot. So I'll start with this. This is a quotation which I think is very apt for this movie. It's a quotation about love. Love is something far more than desire for sexual intercourse. It's the principal means of escape from the loneliness which afflicts most men and women throughout the greater part of their lives. That was said by the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell, and it encapsulates succinctly the essence of this movie. So we're in the UK, in England in 1943. Thousands of American troops are in Yorkshire for manoeuvres before the Normandy invasion towards the end of the Second World War. Normandy, for those who are not familiar, is on the northern beaches of France. The American troops are far away from home, and most for the first time in their lives. In this film, directed by Schlesinger, we follow the paths of three Americans as they try and cope with their loneliness, and they gravitate particularly towards, of course, the young, attractive British girls. And we have Chuck Venera, who's desperate for a bit of sex, and he falls in love with a cute bus conductress, played by Annie Ross. Matt, his buddy, played by Richard Gere, is a sergeant from Arizona, and he meets Jean, played by Lisa Eichhorn. And she's a shopkeeper's daughter whose fiance is fighting for the British. And then there's John, played by William Devine, and he forms a friendship with Helen, played by Vanessa Redgrave. And she's a rich matron-like character whose husband is in the RAF abroad. So that's the backdrop very much for this movie. Three relationships, three love affairs, and we'll follow their paths through this review as well. It's a melodrama and it has some very touching scenes. The dramatic incident with the outbreak of racial violence on New Year's Eve is captured towards the end when a black soldier crosses the racial colour line and dances with an English white girl. There's an engaging pace to the movie, and it has a nostalgic tone. And anyway, as I said, we'll get into this now in some detail. I was very impressed by this movie right from the first frame. It's winter in 1943. It's very bleak as the soldiers, the American troops, arrive in Yorkshire. They come across the locals, of course, early on, and this is captured immediately when children in their terraced houses, and one boy in particular, who's Jean's brother, spots the Americans arriving in their wagons and shouts out to his mother, "The Yanks are here." The boy really likes them, clearly, but his mother is less enthusiastic. Early on, we capture the dialogue between Matt, played by Gere, and Danny, played by Vinero. Typical young single men, even back in the mid-40s, preoccupied with getting their leg over. It captures the mood immediately, and it lays the groundwork for what is to be an opportunity to sit and watch war in the comfort of your own armchair. It's not all happy-go-lucky experiences, however, but there are plenty of scenes that I loved. The movie is much more than just an entertainment involving three romances, so stay tuned. We know at the breakfast table, Jean's father comes in. He's been working two jobs to make ends meet, and the family are relatively poor. His wife, played by Rachel Roberts, exchanges conversations with him about overdoing it, doing two jobs, and getting him settled down so she can provide the breakfast to him. Very much capturing the role of a wife at that time. It's wartime, of course. Women didn't work, but they were very much looking after the family and staying at home, homemakers. Sure, but the house was had to be quite tidy, and we see the discipline at the food table. Good manners were taught. Now, Roberts engages in small talk about the Americans and conveys a feeling that, well, they're well off giving things away in contrast to British families being on the poverty line. This is very much the perception that the British had of those rich Americans across the pond, even though these young guys, of course, are there to get involved in the dirtiest of conflicts. I imagine my parents a little bit at this time using this moral code, which was about acceptable behaviour and what isn't. And of course, there's a mixture of feelings about how the Yanks are presented in this movie. A poignant moment where we see Matt, Gere's character, on the bus as he shares a smile with an elderly man, and the camera moves down to the elderly man's belt, and on his trousers there's a Star of David. So we suspect he's possibly a Jew. Anti-Semitism has been suspected in Poland at the time in the concentration camps. And then in the cinema, we capture Pathé News, which shows us the Burma and Japanese conflict, the occupation by the Japanese forces. And the four lead characters are somewhat sidetracked by becoming flirtatious. Schlesinger focuses on how the public were handling the war, the unsung heroes, the war effort, the emotional toll, loneliness, fear of death daily by bombing, and being away from their loved ones. The American GIs provide scenes of comedy to lighten the mood before they move to the Normandy invasion in France. There's a great scene in the fish and chip shop, classic as the two nationalities mix. Gere watches in amazement as Jean adds the salt. Everyone in Britain has salt on their chips. Brilliant acting by Gere as he watches, and his non-verbal communication captures his giant ability as an actor. The differences and similarities between the cultures being brought to the fore by Schlesinger. Redgrave is also that upper middle class type character who lives in a posh house, but she becomes attached to the officer played by Devine. And as this starts to develop, we witness a contrasting dialogue between what was happening down in the chip shop. He, although Devine is pretty working class, he's managed to attain officer status in the US Army, and he's looking for a relationship that fits his status. And Helen fits the bill. Helen has a housekeeper and a young son at boarding school, and we get intimate details shared between them. Divine, as he receives a letter from his wife, whose fear of loneliness is already developing a huge gulf. One might even suggest that divorce is in the offing, but certainly the possibility of being a widow is ever present. And the same befits a Helen, whose husband is an RAF pilot. And this shared experience of potential loss enables them to gravitate towards each other, albeit briefly, as the film uh, moves forward. And then we switch back to Matt and Jean. We witness a scene outside of the cinema. as Matt arrives to meet Jean. She's arrived early and has caught the eye of fellow US soldiers. Quickly, Matt arrives and uses protective macho way to get rid of the opposition. He cares about her now and despises those who her as an opportunity for a drunken night out with an easy girl. Brings out very strong elements of what I've seen repeatedly here in Thailand as the British arrive into Pattaya and believe that every girl is available, which, because of finances, of course, is pretty near the truth. But it encourages this macho behaviour, and I find it quite an embarrassment when I witness these drunken louts from the UK displaying the worst aspects of their character just because they're in a foreign country. Schlesinger reminds us throughout of the moral climate here. It's still 1944, and courting is still the norm, and morality hasn't really been thrown away as it would be into the late 50s, early 60s. And Jean's flirtation, albeit briefly, is viewed as quite unacceptable by her mother. Jean responds in a defensive manner, saying he hasn't put a hand on me in 3 weeks. But we fast forward, in my mind anyway, to personal experience of witnessing my own mother's lecture about no sex outside marriage to my sister in the mid 60s. It took some time for morals to change. Tenderness and the pain of war is also seen by Helen, who's a volunteer nurse. An American has a damaged leg, and Helen helps draft a letter to his US girlfriend and makes it clear that he's still physically able to have sex and doesn't want to lose her. Helen's son Tim in boarding school is experiencing bullying, and his tearful letter brings emotions to Helen and those confused feelings about being protective towards the son, but contrastingly wanting to flirt with the American. We see the different cultures, the Brits and the Yanks, seen when Matt comes to the family for a meal. Knives and forks are the order of the day by Jean's parents. But Matt, however, he just uses a spoon to cut his food and waves it about as he's trying to engage socially. So Schlesinger deliberately has avoided war scenes here. This film is about how ordinary people adapt to war conditions. Once again, to lighten the mood, there's a boxing tournament between the Brits from the RAF and the American troops. The action creates patriotic screams for your man, and maybe the brutal aspect of this sport is a dress rehearsal for the real event on the battlefield later in France. Jean's fiance comes home, and this throws a spanner in the works for Matt, who really struggles to distance himself from Jean. The scene where with Ken at the family home and a speech by Jean's father suggesting that Ken and Jean are the future, even though Ken is to return to the front to all the dangers inherent in being involved in this bloody war. And then we get the conversation as he departs at the train station, and it touches on that future. His father has promised him a business when he comes back. And of course, Jean would be a part of this. The problem is that Jean's already heard Matt's talk about a future with him in the States, which is far more attractive. Running a hotel and then getting a chain. This generates more wealth, to be certain, and beyond anything likely that Ken could acquire. And this once again brings in a dilemma as Jean tries to unravel her feelings for these men. And then returning to that scene on New Year's Eve in 1943. Everyone's happy and dancing. Gene is there with Matt. And amongst the crowd, there's a mix of American servicemen, some African American, some white. And when a Negro starts dancing with a young British girl in an invigorating way, the white US soldiers start to show their true feelings towards their fellow Americans. There's certainly a lot of booze kicking around, and that leads to one American white soldier heckling the new Negro, and soon violence and the racial prejudice involved in their segregation at home turns the party into a street fight. Very much a history lesson again for the viewer on US civil rights, which have been brought to the fun of Yorkshire. A great musical score is also heard, uh, Glenn Miller style swing jazz. And Matt, clearly uncomfortable with the incident regarding the violence, but he shows a certain aspect of his identity as he sides with the white US soldier. And this develops into a response from the girls where they disagree entirely of this and march off towards the black guys who they seem who's just having a good time. They aren't filled with that sort of racial hatred, as there were very few uh, uh, African American or even African coloured people in the UK at the time of this movie. As mentioned, the UK at this particular time, towards the end of the Second World War, had very few people of colour, with numbers arriving in the mid 50s from the West Indies, as the UK needed them to build up their employment. The UK was suffering from employment shortages as a result of the war and the number of males who were killed in action. And this provoked the need for replenishment from the West Indies, and the African Americans from that part of the world duly arrived in large numbers. But anyway, Ken is eventually killed in action, and then we get this emotional scene with mother and father, and Jean and Matt, and it very much captures the pain of relationships formed and then ended. Jean's parents feel that Matt somehow impacted what has taken place, but Jean has got what she wants now, they see. How did these three relationships end and what happened? Well, I'm not going to tell you all about that. You need to watch the film. Just to say that this has quite a personal impact, this movie, on me, particularly as my parents were involved at the time of the war. My mother and father got married in 1939. He went off to fight. He was stationed in North Africa. And of course, my mother stayed at home. And she apparently, unbeknown to me until I was a lot older, she actually was very lonely and gravitated towards an American GI, and they had a flirtation while my father was overseas. So really struck quite a number of emotional points, this movie. But anyway, it's a tremendous piece of work, I think, and I really do recommend that you get to watch it. And that's my take really on Yanks from 1979, and it's directed by John Schlesinger and starring a very young and a very, very talented Richard Gere.